There are many definitions of dead. I had no pulse and I wasn't breathing. Yes, I think I was dead. And I'm a scientist, highly trained surgeon. I am my own greatest skeptic. I felt my spirit peeling away from my body. And eventually I felt my body break free. And the moment I gave up control, I believe I was being held by Christ, and I had this incredible feeling of His just pouring His love into me. We use love as an emotional word, but it was as though you could not only feel it, but you could experience it and see it, and it was complete and absolute and pure. It was as though I'd been on this long journey to earth, and now I was home. I spent a long time trying to analyze this and really trying to come up with an alternative explanation. I came to the conclusion that it was exactly as I knew it to be, which was true and real. There are some things that are beyond science and beyond medicine.
To heaven and back. Dr. Mary Neal says she drowned while she was kayaking, going without oxygen for 24 minutes. Went to heaven and met Jesus before being miraculously revived. And now she is hoping to teach others how to live a joy-filled life in her new book. It's called 7 Lessons from Heaven. The best-selling author, Dr. Mary Neal, she's a spine surgeon. She joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. So I'm familiar with your story, but for folks at home that don't know it, what happened to you in 1999?
Basically, I was kayaking and went over a waterfall and was pinned beneath the water for 30 minutes. And I drowned and had an extensive near-death experience, after which I was returned to my body with a laundry list of things that I needed to do.
Wow. Searchers were trying to get to you, and they couldn't because the rapids were so fierce. They were trying to get to you. You were underwater with 2 broken legs, trapped upside down in your kayak for 24 minutes. They pull you to shore, they give you CPR and revive you. What happened during that 24-minute span?
During that time, I was held by Christ. I was assured that everything would be fine. My spirit was released. We went through a life review in which I came to understand truly what God's grace means.
What is a life review?
Oh gosh, Christ and I went through my life and pulled out incidents or episodes and looked at that event from everyone's perspective. And I learned 2 things. I learned that when you understand everything that brought people to that point in time, all of their hurts, their sorrows, their joys, when you understand what created the event, it's not just that you have forgiveness, but you very easily offer grace. And it's the same grace that God gives us. And I also learned that God's promise of beauty coming from all things is absolutely true. I was shown it again and again and again, but we can't really appreciate it unless we look retrospectively.
What did it look like, and is heaven real?
Heaven is awesome, and heaven is absolutely real. It's not just a state of mind. It is a place where God's love is so intense and so pure that no one ever wants to come back.
You know what, when I learned about your story, you had so many reasons to come back. You had 4 young children. As a mother, that's all mom's biggest fear, all parents' biggest fear. We're going to leave our children at a young age without any direction, or a mom in their life or a parent in their life. You had every reason to come back, but you didn't want to.
I had every reason to come back. That is for sure. But juxtaposed to God's intense, pure love, I didn't want to come back. I felt like I was home. I was in our real home, everyone's real home.
Wow, that gives me chills. Because we always say the people that are left behind, they're the ones that are in torment and grieving, and it's hard. But we, as Christians, believe we'll see each other again. So
we absolutely will see each other again. And when we're left behind and grieving, it's because we forgot to trust that God promises a plan for each one of our lives. It's one of hope. And that's something I write about a lot, because the whole purpose of the second book, 7 Lessons, is to take my experience from just being a nice story sitting on the shelf
Right.
and saying, okay, what did I learn from that experience that not only changes my life, but what can be applied daily to your life and everyone's life to create joy.
Well, I know so many people are going to go buy your book today on Amazon. Tell me the name of the book again.
7 Lessons from Heaven.
All right, Dr. Mary Neal, thank you.
Thank you so much.
We're glad you came back to tell your story and be there for your kids.
Thank you.
So I've spent a number of years now thinking about my experiences and processing them and discussing them with people as I've been speaking and as I've been listening to their own stories. And I have realized that there are a number of lessons that came out of my experiences, and that prompted me to share them in the current book that I wrote, 7 Lessons from Heaven. There are really more than 7, but I was able to whittle it down and combine some of them. But truly, some of the most important ones have to do with the fact that God is love. God loves us more than we can ever imagine. And in that love has incredible grace for us, knows each one of us, and has a plan for each one of us that is one of hope. It's more beautiful than we can imagine, and regardless of our circumstances, God takes those circumstances and creates great beauty. In addition to that, there's no question that I learned God is real and present, working in our world. God's miracles are present if we look for them. Heaven is absolutely real. And what I've discovered is, even if you forget about everything else, if all you do is accept that there really is life after death, it's a game changer. It changes everything about today. Because if you don't have to worry about tomorrow, and hopefully if you accept God's grace for yesterday, then what I've discovered is you can live entirely today. That doesn't mean you don't plan for tomorrow, and it doesn't mean that you hurry it up, but what it means is that you can be fully present in every moment of each day. What I saw was truly beyond description. Everything seemed physical in that the people I saw did have head, arms, legs. They had these robes on that seemed to be woven together with fibers of love. And I know that doesn't really make sense, but that's what it was. When I saw the colors, it's as though I understood them. I saw them, I could taste them, I could hear them. I understood their very essence. And I realized none of this makes sense in our language, but that's what it was. We were communicating in a very pure sense. It was almost like a blast of energy. And I suppose I would say that I understood it in English because that's my native tongue. And when I think about what I was told, I think about it in English. But at the same time, the communication was on a much more pure basis. And we traveled up this path, and the path seemed solid in that it was directional and we were moving along it. But the edges just sort of faded into nothingness. And I would say the same thing below and above. Nothing existed except for us and except for where we were going. I didn't ever feel any sense of gravity. I felt like I was a physical entity in that I had some structure or shape. But I didn't feel gravity, I didn't feel weight. When we came to this structure, it seemed like there were blocks or bricks, and again, it seemed like they were woven together with love. I never leaned against them, so I don't know how solid they felt. And I will be the first to acknowledge that I don't know if that's how it always appears. I know that that's how it appeared to me, but it may be that
that's because that's what I would understand. I absolutely believe that God presents to each one of us the experience that we will understand, the experience that will speak to us and move us and make us feel loved, make us understand that God's grace is real.
Could you describe briefly the circumstances and synchronicities of what happened to get you from the river up to the road?
Sure. When I was on the riverbank, you have to understand that this was a very inaccessible part of the river. There were no people, let alone roads. I mean, my husband didn't go kayaking with us that day because you could not get off the river. You were going to be on the river until the takeout. And so when I regained consciousness in my body, I will never ever forget the look on the faces of these guys that were doing CPR, because it was this combination of excitement and shock, because even though we all think CPR works, it doesn't usually work. And especially without advanced medical care, CPR almost never works. And so I think they were shocked, but in addition to that, they were just going, oh, now what? I mean, what do we do now? Because there's nothing. And so while they were in this state of just being shell-shocked, they looked up and there were these Chilean young men. I mean, just there. I mean, they were angels, because there's no possible way to get to this part of the river unless you came by boat. But here were these guys, and one of them had a machete, and a guy had a 2x4, and they just never said a word. Nobody ever spoke to them. They just appeared, and they walked over, put my body on top of a kayak, and then they, with these guys, started carrying me on top of the kayak. And one of the guys, was whapping his way through the bamboo, and the hillsides are very, very steep and very thickly covered with bamboo. So they would, go up and slide back and go up and slide back. And eventually they came to this little animal trail. And so they started following the trail. And after a few hours, they came to a dirt road. And they readily said later they didn't even know what they were hoping for. They just were sort of thinking that eventually they might get to a road, and then maybe they could run for miles and find a tractor or something. I mean, southern Chile in 1999 doesn't have medical care. I mean, it doesn't have that sort of thing. And so eventually they popped out onto a dirt road, and right there was an ambulance. I mean, even now, Santiago has ambulances. Where we were does not have ambulances. And the ambulance was there. And same thing, the driver never said anything. Nobody said anything to the driver. But he just got out, loaded me in, took off. And a couple of the guys then went back to the river, because there were still other people, at the river. And the first thing they did was try to track down these two Chilean fellas. And not only were they not there, but by then people from the nearby village had come, and no one fit the description. I mean, these were non-existent people. And when the people were told about this ambulance, they said, no. That doesn't, like, you Americans are, crazy. Good evening, and thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Mary Neal, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about death, because how you understand death directly determines how you experience life. My own understanding of death changed in 1999 when I died while kayaking in South America. I was pinned under 8 to 10 feet of water at the base of a waterfall, and I was without oxygen for 30 minutes before CPR was initiated. And when I regained consciousness, I was in a state of shock. Not because I just drowned, not because of my multiply broken legs, and not because I was on the side of a remote river with no access to medical care. No, I was in an absolute state of shock because I could not believe that I'd been sent back to my body from a place I will call heaven. It was peaceful underwater, and I was held and comforted by Christ. And no, I didn't just think or hope it was Jesus. I knew it was Christ just as I would know my husband of 30 years if I'd seen him in the grocery store. And I was taken through a life review that had little to do with judgment and everything to do with understanding and compassion and grace. And I was shown the beauty that came out of every heartbreak, every challenge, and every disappointment of my life. And then I was released to the heavens. My spirit rose up and out of the river, and I was immediately greeted by a group of people or spirits who had known me and loved me as long as I have existed. And even as they took me down this beautiful pathway woven together with fibers of God's love and exploding with color and flowers and the aromas of flowers, I could look back at the river, and I watched as my purple bloated body was pulled to the shore and my friends started CPR. And I recognized my body, and I knew that I was dead. But despite having a magnificent life with a wonderful husband and these 4 young children who I loved more than life itself, I felt like I was home, and I really had absolutely no intention of returning. And then I was told it wasn't my time, that I had more work to do on earth, and that I'd have to go back to my body. And when I objected, I was given a laundry list of work yet to be done, none of which was desirable, and all of which would challenge me in one way or another. Especially challenging was news of the coming and unexpected death of my oldest son, who, as many of you know, was hit and killed by a car 10 years later. Now, of course, I did go back to my body, and I spent many of the subsequent days and weeks moving between the 2 worlds, one that contained my past and my future, the God of the universe and all that is love, and one that contained my present, with the family I cherished and the life I enjoyed. Now, I knew I would never be the same again, but at the time I wondered if it was just, a figment of my imagination. Maybe it was the death experience I had always expected. But the problem is, I hadn't had any expectations. Like most of you, I'd never really thought much about my own death. And I certainly hadn't heard of near-death or after-death experiences in 1999. And if I had, I would have discounted them out of hand. Because although I'd been raised in the church, I readily traded my religious beliefs for intellectual ones when I went off to college and medical school. And by 1999, I was a well-trained scientist, doctor, surgeon. I was accomplished, self-confident, smart. Certainly didn't think I needed God. I was probably some mix of humanist, rationalist, material scientist, maybe a cultural Christian, I don't really know. But what I did know is that my experiences underwater had certainly seemed real. And God not only seemed real, but was the only real that mattered. So I needed answers. I spent the many months of my hospitalization and rehab searching for scientific ones. And first I looked to my medical records and the people who'd been at the river, and then really fueled by a desire to discount everything I'd been told, I then read extensively about drowning, about the physiology of a dying brain, about anoxia, dreams, hallucinations, seizures, neurotransmitter dumping. But all of these conventional explanations fell short. and the scientific gaps were really unbridgeable. And nothing could account for my unscathed survival or for my profound spiritual experience. Eventually, I realized I'd had a near-death or after-death experience, and I discovered I wasn't alone in this. Almost 20 million people in this country alone have had these profoundly transformative experiences. And a continuation of the soul or consciousness after death is described in every culture, every faith tradition, and every age group. Even very young children who have never been exposed to religion recount near-death experiences. And we all talk about the same things. We talk about this purity of divine love and interconnectedness with all living creatures. And regardless of what our prior beliefs were, God becomes the only truth. In fact, 75% of atheists encounter a being that they identify as either Jesus or God. And our understanding of death forever changes. Fear disappears, and we all look forward to going home again one day. Now, maybe you understand death as a resurrection or a day of judgment or a spin into another lifetime, or maybe just the dissolution into the energy of the universe. Or maybe you think it's just a hole in the ground waiting to be filled. But what you think about death is important. And I'm here tonight to tell you that death is nothing more than the doorway to home. And it is the very existence of this home that brings context, purpose, and meaning to our time here on earth. Now, to help you understand this idea, I'm going to tell you a story about my childhood home. Now, when I grew up, I loved my home. I loved everything about it. I loved my family, my friends, my neighborhood, my little dog, the trees, the stream behind the house. I loved fresh-cut grass. When I was home, I felt comfortable and content. I felt safe and secure and loved, and I really never wanted to leave. But then one day, I went off to summer camp. Now, I knew I'd be challenged. I was a little nervous. I'd never been away from home, didn't know what to expect. I assumed that I would learn and grow and maybe become a better me. And I did. It was great. I learned to swim and sail and water ski. I learned about kindness and humility. I made friends. We made bonfires. It was great. But of course, it wasn't all good. The beds were hard, and I really didn't like the food. My sandals were stolen one day, and I was pretty angry. But I actually felt compassion for the little girl when I learned of her plight. And I ended up giving her most of my clothes. And I hated the time I spent in the nurse's cabin after being stung by a bee. But I was able to find humor in all of this because I knew that my time at camp was temporary. And before long, I'd be going back to my comfortable and familiar home. Sure enough, the camp bus came, took me home. And my friends were sad and they cried a little bit. But really, I was looking forward to going home and sleeping in my own bed, and I knew my family would be waiting for me, and they'd be overjoyed by my return. Now, the point I'm making with this story is that it was the existence and reality of my childhood home and the knowledge that I'd be going back there again that brought a context to my time at camp that allowed me to experience it as a great adventure. And since 1999, that's exactly how I experienced my life here on earth. The reality and existence of our true and permanent spiritual home, the one I discovered on the other side of death, and the knowledge that I and you will be going back there one day, brings a context to my time on earth that allows me to experience it as a great adventure with great meaning and purpose, and it changes the way I experience both good times and bad. Now, another way of understanding this concept is with this next slide. Many of you will immediately see the white cup, and some of you will see the blue faces, and which you see is a matter of focus and perspective. If you focus entirely on the cup, you'll miss the blue faces that give it context. And if you focus entirely on the faces, you'll miss the beauty and the purpose of the cup. Now imagine for a minute that this white cup represents our lifetime here on earth. And the blue faces represent the people and the love and the reality of our home. Without the background of our home and the faces within it, this white cup of life becomes nothing but potential. Now, the relationship between my childhood home and camp, or the faces and the cup, is the same relationship that exists between our true spiritual home and our time on earth. Now, many of you may not want to believe this spiritual home exists, and you may not want to talk about or even think about your own death, but that does not change the truth and the reality of this relationship. And I encourage you to wake up. Wake up to the potential of your life. And I'm not talking about choosing to live differently or more intentionally. I'm talking about experiencing the profound transformation of your daily life, of who you really are, how you live and why you live, that occurs only when you live in the context of our true spiritual home. Metaphysical questions become important. Problems become opportunities. Love becomes the only thing that really matters. And the door to experiencing God's presence in your daily life begins to open. And most profoundly, joy. Joy that transcends circumstances will become a state of being. I can honestly tell you that even in my deepest, darkest days of sorrow and grief after the loss of my son, I still experienced great joy, because that is the power of this transformation. And that is why I encourage you now, I challenge you tonight to put aside your excuses, put aside your complacency, get rid of your intellectual barriers and sit with your thoughts. Actually question your current beliefs. Go home and do some research, collect your own data, and try to prove what I'm saying wrong, because I know you can't. And I know that even without your coming close to death, if you honestly undertake a process of spiritual exploration and discovery, your daily life will change for the better in ways that you have no ability to even imagine. Thank you for listening. I used to be a very typical American Christian. I went to Sunday school when I was a kid. I was confirmed in the church when I was in middle school. And then I went to college and medical school and training. And I bought into the idea that you had to choose between science and spirituality. Now, I was a good person. I mean, I certainly bought into the concept of being a good person and honest and ethical and a woman of integrity and all those sorts of things. But the fact is, I was really busy. I became a wife, a full-time surgeon. I was the director of spine surgery at a big university. And pretty soon I had 4 little kids to take care of. I mean, Jesus to me was one more thing on my to-do list that I knew I was never going to get to. But that all changed one day in 1999 when I died. And yes, I literally mean died. I spent 30 minutes under 8 to 10 feet of water without oxygen at the base of this waterfall. And while I was underwater and dying, I asked that God's will be done. And the minute I asked that, I was immediately overcome with a very, very physical sensation of being held and comforted and reassured by Christ. And he took me through a life review that was like nothing I could have imagined. I was reinserted into every one of the most painful memories of my life. But this time was different. I had a complete understanding of the life story of the other people involved, and I felt nothing but compassion, even for the people who had hurt me deeply. And I discovered that where God's love is present, there is no room for destructive emotion. I discovered grace. And then I was also shown the beauty that came out of each and every one of those painful experiences when seen from a distant perspective. Eventually, my body came over the front deck of my boat, and when that happened, my spirit rose up and out of the river, and I was immediately greeted by a group of people or spirits, beings, who were so overjoyed to welcome me home. I know that they had loved me and known me as long as I have existed. And even as I was with them and rejoicing, I could look back at the river and I could see my friends pull my bloated purple body to shore and watch them start CPR. And I had a wonderful life. But even as I watched that, I knew that I was home and I had no intention of returning. And these people, or spirits, started taking me down this beautiful pathway that exploded with colors and flowers and the aromas of flowers, which is what speaks beauty to my soul. And I absolutely believe that God presents to each one of us the experience at the time of our death that does speak beauty to us, that lets us know that we are known and loved. And we finally got to the end of this pathway, and I was there for what felt like many, many hours. And during my time there, I had a complete understanding of the divine order of the universe, how it could possibly be true that there is a God that is real and present today, knows each and every one of the billions of us on this planet individually, loves each and every one of us as though we're the only ones, and has a plan for each and every one of us and for the world that's one of hope. And eventually I was told that it wasn't my time, that I had more work to do on earth, and that I would have to go back to my body. So I did what any reasonable person would do, and I said, I'm good, I can stay. But here I am, I got kicked out. But they took that opportunity to then give me this laundry list of work yet to be done. Everything on the list would be challenging, but certainly one of the most challenging things on that list had to do with the coming and unexpected death of my oldest son. He was hit and killed by a car 10 years later, but at that time he was only 9. And when I asked the obvious question of why my boy, I was immediately returned to my life review, where I had been shown the truth in God's promise that beauty comes of all things, eventually. And I was reminded that it is always a matter of trust, trusting God's promises to us. And with that, then, I was reunited with my body. And I continued to have supernatural experiences over the next couple of weeks. But then finally the window, my personal window into heaven, closed. And I was left with the consequences of my injury, and I underwent many, many surgeries and many more months of rehab. And I spent those many months of rehab trying to figure out what had happened to me. I researched extensively every possible explanation or excuse that anyone had ever mentioned. I researched, of course, dreams and hallucinations and DMT or other neurotransmitter trips. Could it have been just the physiologic process of a dying brain? And at the end of many, many months of research, I had to conclude that mine had been a true and spiritual experience. And I discovered also that science and spirituality actually coexist very easily because they answer different questions. And I also discovered that I wasn't alone in this experience. Almost 20 million people in this country alone have had this sort of profoundly transformative experience. And I've spent many years, of course, thinking about my experiences, and I recognize that my most important transformation was moving from hope or a faith in God's promises to an absolute trust. And I do not mean to discount the faith of the Bible, but faith in our culture is so often based on reading or other people's experiences, and it can certainly be strong, but it can just as easily be shaken or lost when challenged. But trust is solid. Trust is an active choice based on the presence of God and the experience of God's trustworthiness in one's own life. And I will tell you that trust for me is sort of faith in action. And I will tell you what it looks like in my life. First of all, because of trust, I'm free. I am free from all bondage to my past. I don't feel guilt. I don't feel remorse, regret for anything I've done or not done. Because I trust that God knows me completely and knows my story, knows my failings. And in that knowledge, through grace, feels nothing but compassion for me. And I also know that I would feel nothing but compassion for people in my past, because if I knew their true story, I too would feel nothing but compassion for them. And so I am free from bitterness, hate, anger, even minor irritation that people have caused me. And I don't have worry or anxiety about my future, because I trust that God has a plan for my life that is one of hope. And I'm certainly not afraid of death. I trust, and actually I will claim to know, that there really is life after death, heaven, whatever you want to call it. And I actually believe that it is the very reality of that heaven that brings context and meaning and purpose to my own life. And what I mean by that is best shown in this next slide. Many of you will see a white cup, and some of you will see blue faces. But if you focus entirely on the cup, you'll miss the context and the meaning provided by the faces. And if you focus entirely on the blue faces, you'll miss the beauty and the purpose of the cup. Now, if you imagine for a minute that that white cup represents our life here on earth, and the blue faces represent heaven, God's people, God's intention, God's love. If you take away that background of heaven, then this white cup of life becomes nothing but potential. So, I'm free from my past. I don't worry about the future. And heaven brings a context and meaning to my life. So what that means is that I am absolutely free to be fully present in every moment of this day. And because I trust all of God's promises, that means that I also trust what the Bible says about God's presence in my life. I trust that God is always present, that there's nothing that can separate me from his love, that beauty will come of all things in its time, and that all things work together for good. So what that does is it allows me to rise above my momentary circumstances and experience joy. It allows me to be free to experience the joy-filled life that I believe God intends for each one of us. And wonderfully, you don't have to die to make this transformation, but you do have to open your heart. And that is why I am here today. Because I want to share my story, but more importantly, I want to challenge you, every one of you, to try to prove anything I've said wrong. Because I know that you can't. And I also know that in the process of trying, your lives will be transformed in ways that you cannot even begin to imagine. So thank you and God bless you. Yes, I had a profound near-death experience, profound spiritual transformation, like many of you. And I wrote a couple of best-selling books, and I've been on all kinds of talk shows and all sorts of things. Because an experience is only valuable if it has the power to provoke thought, provoke change, growth, especially if it pushes you in the direction of spiritual transformation and love. I did what most smart, intelligent, accomplished people do. I said, okay, that spiritual stuff, that's not for me. I mean, I fully subscribe to the religion of the intellect. And I was probably somewhere between a humanist and a rationalist. But regardless, I absolutely accepted this false choice that we're asked to make, which is you either believe in science or you believe in spirituality. I said, oh, count me in with the science. The hillsides are very, very steep. They're very thickly covered in bamboo. The section of river was entirely inaccessible and entirely requiring of a complete commitment. Once you put on the river, you were going downstream no matter what. I rocketed down the waterfall. The front end of my boat became pinned or stuck in the rocks and the underwater features. And the boat and I were then completely submerged under 8 to 10 feet of water. And I'm a spine surgeon. I don't know that I welcome high-stress situations, but I'm certainly very comfortable with them. And so I didn't panic. Everyone always says, oh my gosh, didn't you panic? And no, I'm not really a panicky sort of person, but I did go about trying to free the boat, trying to free me from the boat. It was evident that that was not going to work. And I am a very pragmatic, concrete thinking person. I assumed that I was going to die. I knew that the likelihood of being rescued was slim at best, probably zero. I've seen people die on the river. And I thought about my options, which weren't very many, but I made a decision to very actively ask that God's will be done. Whatever you want to call God, whoever God is to you. And I will tell you, at that point in my life, when I thought about God, it was like, I don't know. When I thought about death, it was, I don't know. I hope there's something more. I don't know. It doesn't really matter to me. In that moment, though, I said, okay, I ask that your will be done regardless of what that means. The moment I asked that, everything shifted. I was immediately being held and comforted and reassured by Christ that everything was fine. I'd be fine, my husband would be fine, my little children that I showed you would be fine, regardless of whether I lived or died. And I have to say, I was sort of, wow, this is a pretty good hallucination. It's not really what I expected, but I went with it. I had this shift in time and dimension so that I felt like every moment expanded into all of eternity. And similarly, all of eternity was contained within each one of those moments that I was underwater. And one of the things we did is go through a life review. And I have to tell you, again, I never really thought about it. If someone had asked me about a life review, I would have assumed it was the Hollywood version. You know, your life flashes across the sky and, you know, you feel really good about some things. You kind of pat yourself on the back, and some things you think, I could have done that better. And I would have imagined, you know, the bright light tunnel. I mean, all those things that we see in the movies. But my life review was nothing that I could have imagined. It was everything about love and nothing about judgment, which is really, you know, what we're all afraid of. We all blow it. but it had nothing to do with that. We sort of looked at all the events of my life, sort of like swiping left to right on an iPhone, going through the photos, and Christ would sort of pull out one of those events. And I have to tell you, none of these events were good ones. Every event that went by were the most painful, the most traumatic, the most hurtful, the most miserable experiences of my life. And we all have those experiences, right? Every single one. And every single one he pulled out was really miserable. And there were events where either I hurt someone I loved, or someone hurt me, or deeply hurt someone else that I loved. And I would find myself immediately back in that experience. And it wasn't just that I re-experienced that event or re-experienced it from my perspective, but I understood me in that situation, and I had an absolute understanding of the other people involved in every event. And it wasn't just understanding their perspective. I understood them. I understood everything about their life story, everything about what brought them to that point in time where they hurt me, or I hurt them, or they hurt someone I loved. It's not a matter of forgiveness. It's a matter of grace. Anger, resentment, shame, all of that is replaced by incredible compassion and love and kindness. You know, just as an aside, an example. 2 weeks ago, I was on an airplane, and it's a long, involved story. I was making multiple connections, and the first step of this travel log was on this little plane. It had already been delayed an hour. I was just barely going to make my connection, and I was on my way home, so I really wanted to make that connection. And we loaded on the plane, and we weren't taking off, and I was just thinking, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding. I want to get home. And then there was this kid screaming, and finally the kid gets brought up to the front of the plane, and the parents want off the plane. And you can imagine everyone on the plane was rather upset. So they brought the jetway back out. Kid and the two parents got off, and then of course they had to wait because the stroller and everything else had been gate checked, so we had to wait. And so they pull the jetway away, or they start to. And then I'm looking at my watch and I'm going, okay, I'm definitely going to miss my connection, but if I stay here in this airport, I can get the next flight. So I go up to the front and I say, wow, I got to get off this plane. So you can imagine what people were thinking about me too, but at least I was a little quicker. So they bring the jetway back, I get off. As I'm out there, I see the parents and this kid. And I will admit, I was a little upset, but there were other people who were really quite cruel. When they were getting off the plane, there were a number of people who made comments that were really pretty biting. And I ended up chatting with these parents, and as it turns out, this kid was a foster kid and had been pulled out of this human trafficking ring in the Eastern Bloc in Romania. And every time the kid was taken to a new abusive situation, he was put on a plane. And for this kid, being put on a plane meant going further into the depths of misery. And so he absolutely refused to fly on the plane. Now, in hearing that, how can you be upset, right? All of a sudden, your irritation because you're not making your schedule is replaced with incredible compassion and love, not only for this boy, but for the parents of love. We'd get a little bit further down the path, and I could still look back at the scenes at the river. I could see my body. I thought, ooh, that doesn't look so good. I mean, I was purple and bloated and fixed dilated pupils. I mean, I was dead as a doornail. I'd been underwater for 30 minutes at that point. Being kind, being respectful, being tolerant of others. You know, I think that's what it comes down to. And again, I kept trying to get over this threshold because I knew that was it. That was the point of no return. And eventually these people told me that it wasn't my time, that I had more work to do on earth, and that I would have to go back to my body. And so I did what I think any reasonable person would do, and I said, okay, and now I'm good, I can stay. I had already been reassured by Christ that everything would be fine. So I objected, and when I objected, I was given a laundry list of work I still had to do. And I have to tell you, there wasn't a single thing on that list that I was excited about. There wasn't a single thing on that list that I felt qualified to do, that I felt like I had the time to do. Every single thing on the list was something that would challenge me, push me, make me step outside of my comfort zone, because that's the way it is, right? I mean, nobody changes when things are good. When things are good, we never want to change. The reality is we change and learn and grow when we're challenged. We can all look back at ourselves from 20 years ago, and we can see all the ways in which we've changed. And usually we've changed in better ways. It's impossible for us to look 20 years in the future and know how we will be different. But intellectually, we all know we will be. And we will be different because of the challenges we have faced. So this laundry list was filled with many challenges, including news of the coming and unexpected death of my oldest son, who at the time was only 9 years old. And indeed, 10 years later, he was hit by a car and killed. When I was told specifically about my son's coming death, I asked the question that would be on anyone's lips, which is why? Why my son? And when I asked that, I was immediately reminded of my life review, in which I had been shown again and again and again the truth of God's promise that beauty comes of all things. And I was reminded that it's a matter of trust. We may not see the beauty that comes out of challenge and heartbreak and heartache, but we can trust that that beauty will eventually emerge, whether we can see it or not. And with that, then, I was taken back to my body and reunited there on the side of the river. And I have to tell you, this river was in the middle of nowhere. It was in South America, and it was in southern Chile. And in 1999, at that point in time, there was nothing. There were barely any dirt roads. There was no search and rescue. There was no medical care. We didn't have cell phones or sat phones or any way to communicate. If we had, there was no one to call anyway. And so when I regained consciousness, I, of course, was in a state of shock because I couldn't believe that I got kicked out. And the people who resuscitated me were in an absolute state of shock because they were thinking, wow, first of all, CPR doesn't usually work. Works 75% of the time on TV, and so we think it works. But the reality is, it doesn't usually work. And when you're out in the middle of nowhere, it really doesn't work. And after 30 minutes without oxygen, it never works. And so they were in a state of shock, first of all, because I actually opened my eyes, but they were also in a state of shock because they were thinking, oh, now what? We were in the middle of nowhere. There was no way out other than the river. The hillsides were very, very steep and very thickly covered with bamboo. And just as they were trying to figure out what they were going to do next, these two Chilean men just appeared. They didn't have a boat. There's no other way to get there. But they appeared, they never said anything. They just walked over, put my body on top of a boat, and then they, with these friends of mine, just started trying to carry me up the hillside. One of them actually had a machete. And it was a many-hour process. And after a number of hours, we emerged onto this tiny dirt road, as I said, in the middle of nowhere. And exactly there on the road was an ambulance. Now, even today, and I go back to Chile every year, and even today in this part of Chile, I mean, there are not ambulances. And the nearest medical services were 4 or 5 hours drive away. And the ambulance driver hopped out, and these friends of mine described him wearing what a 5-year-old would imagine an ambulance driver was supposed to wear. It was just a little off. And he never said a word. He never said, wow, what's happened? I was a mess. I mean, I had both legs were multiply broken. I just drowned. I was on this kayak. I mean, you can imagine this is a scene that clearly would tell someone that there's a problem. But this guy never said a word. He never asked what had happened. He just calmly walked over, started putting me in the back of the ambulance. And when one of my friends looked at him and said, "What are you doing here?" he just very calmly said, "Waiting." Do I believe he was an angel? Absolutely. Do I believe the young men who appeared on the riverbank were angels? Absolutely. The friends of mine spent the next 2 days trying to track down the ambulance driver, trying to track down the people, and of course, they didn't exist. And I have to tell you that the subsequent days and weeks were filled with more profound, undeniable miracles. And I had this experience of being neither here nor there. I was sort of moving between the two worlds, one that contained my past and my future, the God of the universe and all that is love, and one that contained my present with the family I cherish and the life I enjoy. After a few weeks, things sort of, kind of that veil sort of pacified. I had a couple of more out-of-body experiences where I believe I was back in heaven. It was the same intensity of God's love, the same intensity of beauty and emotion. I had more conversation with Christ, specifically about this laundry list and about my son's coming death. And then eventually that was over. And I was left with what to make of it. And I have to tell you that at the time, I sort of thought, well, I probably just imagined that. Even though I have absolutely no creativity, I thought, well, it's a figment of my imagination. Even though I knew I would never be the same again. So I set about trying to figure out what had happened to me. And I spent the many, many weeks and months of my hospitalization and rehabilitation trying to come up with a scientific explanation. So I first read through all my medical records and talked to the people at the river, and then really fueled by this absolute desire to discount everything I'd been told, including what I'd been told about my son's coming death, I read extensively. I read pretty much everything that has ever been written about drowning, about the physiology of a dying brain, about dreams and hallucinations and anoxia and seizures and neurotransmitter dumping. In the end, though, I discovered that all of the conventional explanations fell short. Those medical and scientific gaps were really unbridgeable. And absolutely nothing could explain either my unscathed survival or my profound spiritual experiences. And eventually I realized that I'd had a near-death or after-death experience. And I also discovered that I wasn't alone in that experience. Almost 20 million people in this country alone have had these sorts of profoundly transformative experiences. And the